From a teenager pulling the trigger on his own father to a revival that could change everything we thought we knew, Dexter's story isn't over, and this time they can't afford to screw it up. With the past catching up and the future riding on Harrison, here's everything Dexter Resurrection has to get right. Starting with one that's on everyone's mind, Harrison needs a real, brutal identity crisis. Harrison Morgan's identity crisis lies at the core of what makes Dexter's universe so compelling. No one can deny that. In Dexter New Blood, we witness a Harrison who merely scratched the surface of his inner darkness. After tracking down Dexter in Iron Lake, he showed us his vigilante tendencies by confronting school predator Ethan Williams, teasing the possible inheritance of his father's violent nature. Yet this psychological exploration remained frustratingly incomplete. For Resurrection to truly work, Harrison has to confront a far more profound battle within himself. Set in New York City, where he's fled after shooting his father, the upcoming series positions him as a young man attempting to rebuild his life while carrying the weight of patricide. But Harrison's entire existence has been defined by trauma: his mother Rita's brutal murder by Trinity, years spent in foster care, and his violent reunion with Dexter all create the perfect psychological storm. Unlike Dexter, whose dark passenger and code were firmly established through years of Harry's guidance, Harrison's moral compass remains undefined. This creates the perfect opportunity to explore a truly brutal identity crisis. Does Harrison carry the same need as his father? Or is his darkness different, perhaps more rooted in rage and abandonment than compulsion? The more compelling narrative would force Harrison to confront impossible choices through real situations. Maybe he too discovers other killers, or he finds himself drawn to vigilante justice without Dexter's structured approach. Or maybe he tries to suppress his urges entirely, only to have them manifest in destructive ways. Harrison's journey should explore fundamental questions. Can he escape his genetic legacy? Is the dark passenger inherited or created? Could Harrison develop a more ethical approach to his darkness than his father ever managed? These questions would drive a psychological thriller worthy of the Dexter legacy. What makes Harrison's potential arc so fascinating is his unique position. Unlike Dexter, who was molded by Harry's code from childhood, Harrison discovered his father's true nature as a young adult. This late-stage revelation, combined with his own dark impulses, create fertile ground for exploring whether serial killing is truly in his blood or if redemption remains possible. For the story to work, Harrison can't simply retread Dexter's path. His crisis has to feel distinct, perhaps more externalized, more rage-driven, or more socially connected than his father's cold, ritualistic approach. The writers have an opportunity to create a character who understands his darkness but struggles with whether to channel it, fight it, or find some middle ground that Dexter never could. The most compelling version of Harrison would be one torn between competing moral frameworks, not just Dexter's code, but also the normal life he glimpsed with his step-family, the survival instincts he developed while on his own, and whatever new influences he encounters in New York. This complexity would honor the psychological depth that made the original series so groundbreaking, while taking the concept in fresh directions. And if Harrison's inner war is the heart of the show, then Dexter's return is the gamble that could make or break it. Also, Dexter's return has to be justified. Dexter Morgan's survival after the events of New Blood presents one of the biggest narrative challenges for Resurrection. We witness Harrison shoot his father directly in the chest, saw him bleeding out in the snow, and watched as the Iron Lake Police Chief Angel Bishop called for an ambulance, while Harrison fled the scene. If the series wants to maintain its credibility, Dexter's survival cannot be waved away with just convenient plot devices.
The reality is there's nobody left alive who can handle my truth.
The most plausible explanation would involve immediate medical intervention. The opening of Dexter Original Sin already established that Dexter was rushed to an emergency room where doctors were able to resuscitate him. This provides a foundation, but the series needs to build upon it with concrete medical details. Perhaps the bullet missed vital organs, or the extreme cold slowed his bleeding, buying precious time for paramedics to arrive. But physical survival isn't enough. The show must also address the legal ramifications. Angela Bishop had discovered Dexter's true identity as the Bay Harbor Butcher, connected him to multiple murders, and witnessed Harrison shooting him. She had even contacted Angel Batista, who was on his way to Iron Lake with evidence from the original case. This creates a complex web that Dexter couldn't simply escape through medical luck. For Dexter's return to feel earned, the series needs to show how he navigated this precarious legal situation. Did he fake his death officially after being resuscitated? Did he use connections or blackmail to escape custody? Or did the evidence against him somehow fall apart? The explanation must be thorough enough to satisfy viewers who saw his apparent demise as a fitting conclusion to his story, suggesting things like Harrison's bullet just missed the important parts, or that Angela decided to cover for Dexter despite her commitment to justice would feel like cheap retcons of New Blood's powerful finale. Instead, Dexter's survival should come at a significant cost. Perhaps physical limitations from his injury, legal jeopardy that follows him to New York, or psychological trauma that alters his approach to killing. Dexter has always been able to navigate impossible situations through meticulous planning and adaptability. His return should showcase these qualities rather than rely on implausible luck. The best justification would involve a carefully orchestrated plan that reveals Dexter's continued evolution as a character rather than simply resetting him to the status quo. The show has an opportunity to transform what could be a narrative weakness into a strength by making Dexter's survival and subsequent escape part of a larger story about the consequences of his actions finally catching up to him. This approach would honor the themes of New Blood while creating compelling new tensions for Resurrection. But if Dexter is back, then so is the truth, and nobody is closer to it than Angel Batista. Angel Batista's revelation in New Blood stands as one of the biggest loose ends in the entire Dexter franchise. After years of working alongside Dexter as a clueless colleague, Batista was finally on the verge of discovering his friend's true identity as the Bay Harbor Butcher. The moment when Angela Bishop called him about her suspicions, revealing she had a suspect named Jim Lindsay, who was actually Dexter Morgan, was electric. Batista's stunned response that he was packing a bag and bringing the original Bay Harbor Butcher files to Iron Lake promised a confrontation fans had waited nearly a decade to see. Yet New Blood concluded without delivering on this pivotal moment. Batista never arrived in Iron Lake, never confronted Dexter about his betrayal, and never got to process the shock of learning his friend and colleague was the notorious serial killer he once defended against Dokes' posthumous accusation. The unresolved thread cannot remain dangling in Resurrection. With David Zayas confirmed to return as Batista, the new series has to show his reaction to learning that Dexter survived. His journey should reflect the complexity of his character, a good-hearted detective who trust was completely violated. Batista shouldn't simply abandon his investigation because Dexter was supposedly dead. His dedication to justice, now fueled by personal betrayal, would drive him to confirm Dexter's fate and understand the full scope of his crimes. The story possibilities are rich with dramatic potential. Batista might form an unlikely alliance with Harrison, both processing their complicated relationships with Dexter. He could lead a renewed investigation to the Bay Harbor Butcher cases, perhaps connecting them to new murders in New York that suggest that Dexter has resumed his killing. Most importantly, if Dexter is indeed alive, Batista deserves his long-delayed confrontation, a scene where these two men, who shared years of history, finally face each other with all secrets exposed. For Resurrection to honor the narrative promises of New Blood, Batista's pursuit of Dexter should be relentless and emotionally charged. Anything less would undermine one of the most compelling unresolved storylines in the Dexter saga. The Miami detective, who once defended Dexter against accusations, is now facing the truth about his former friend, would provide the moral weight and emotional stakes the new series needs to justify its existence. Resurrection has the perfect opportunity to finally deliver the payoff that New Blood only teased, allowing Batista to complete his journey from friend to pursuer, from defender to potential executioner of justice for the Bay Harbor Butcher. If Batista's finally putting the pieces together, then things are about to blow wide open. Hit subscribe if you're ready for it. As Batista digs into Dexter's past, Harrison's future depends on whether he rewrites the code or destroys it completely, because the code has to evolve or break. Harrison Morgan inheriting the Code of Harry would be the most predictable and least interesting direction for Resurrection.
But I have to wait. I have to be careful and follow the Code of Harry.
We've already spent 8 seasons of the original series and 1 revival watching Dexter navigate Harry's rules. The world doesn't need another serial killer following the same playbook. Harrison's relationship with moral killing must chart new territory to justify continuing the story. In New Blood, Harrison showed both attraction to and repulsion from his father's methods. He admired the justice Dexter delivered to criminals like Kurt Caldwell, but was ultimately horrified by the ritualistic nature of Dexter's kills. This contradiction created the perfect foundation for Harrison to develop his own moral framework. Unlike Dexter, who was shaped entirely by Harry's guidance from childhood, Harrison came into his darkness as a young adult with multiple moral influences. He spent years with Hannah in Argentina, lived with various foster families, and briefly reconnected with his father. This diverse background would naturally lead to a more nuanced perspective on violence and justice. Resurrection has several compelling directions it could take Harrison's moral evolution. First, Harrison could develop a less lethal code. Perhaps he channels his darkness into traumatizing predators rather than killing them. Psychological torture that leaves them alive, but broken. This would create tension where these traumatized victims later become witnesses against him. Alternatively, Harrison might reject premeditated killing entirely, only acting in moments of immediate danger. A reactive vigilante, rather than a calculating predator like his father. This approach would create unpredictable, chaotic scenarios unlike Dexter's careful planning. The most interesting possibility would be Harrison abandoning codified rules completely, forcing him to make moral judgments in the moment without the psychological comfort of following established guidelines. This would create genuine moral complexity that the original code often sidestepped with its clear boundaries. Whatever decisions the writers choose, Harrison's approach should reflect his unique psychology. He doesn't have Dexter's emotional detachment, ritualistic compulsions, or compartmentalization skills. His darkness seems more rooted in rage and abandonment than the cold void Dexter experienced. This fundamental difference should manifest in how Harrison processes his violent impulses. Subscribe now if you think that Harrison's going to end up more dangerous than his dad, because the signs are already there. Resurrection has the chance to explore deeper questions than the original series ever did. Can violence ever truly serve justice? Is a modified code better than none at all? These questions, filtered through Harrison's distinct perspective, would push the franchise into genuinely new territory, rather than simply rehashing the moral dilemmas Dexter already explored. Still, even the best code means nothing without a villain who knows how to break it. Which means we need no more soft villains, we need real threats. Kurt Caldwell in New Blood was competently portrayed by Clancy Brown, but he never reached the psychological menace that defined the series' best antagonist. As a trucker who kidnapped and preserved young women in a twisted trophy room, Caldwell had disturbing qualities, but lacked the intellectual challenge and personal connection that made Trinity so unforgettable.
I couldn't care less about your life. Or death. Unless you get in my way.
The Dexter franchise reached its highest point when the villain serves as a dark mirror to our protagonist. Trinity worked brilliantly because he represented what Dexter could become. A killer with a family who maintained his facade for decades while harboring unspeakable brutality beneath. Their psychological chess match elevated Season 4 to the show's pinnacle. For Resurrection to recapture that tension, it needs a villain who challenges Harrison, and potentially Dexter, on multiple levels. This antagonist should be as intelligent as the Morgans, a methodology that questions their moral frameworks, and a personal connection that raises emotional stakes. The casting of Peter Dinklage as Leon Prater and Uma Thurman as Charlie suggests potential for complex adversaries who bring more to the table than straightforward menace. The best Dexter villains have always embodied thematic counterpoints to the protagonist. The eye-struck killer challenged Dexter's suppressed humanity. Trinity confronted his ability to balance family and killing. Miguel Prado tested his capacity for friendship and trust. Jordan Chase exposed his protective instincts. A compelling villain for Resurrection would force Harrison to confront aspects of himself he's trying to deny or control. One promising approach would be introducing an antagonist who targets the guilty through non-lethal means. Perhaps a blackmailer or psychological tormentor who exposes and punishes predators without killing them. This would force Harrison to question whether his own violent impulses are necessary or if justice can be served without bloodshed. Alternatively, a villain with legitimate grievances against Dexter, perhaps a relative of one of his victims or someone whose life was destroyed by his actions, would create moral complexity that Kurt Caldwell never achieved. This antagonist could view Harrison as complicit in his father's crimes, creating a personal vendetta that feels earned rather than arbitrary. What Resurrection needs most is a villain who makes viewers uncomfortable with the graphic nature of the violence and the disturbing logic of their worldview. Someone whose twisted ideology contains uncomfortable truths that force both Harrison and the audience to question their assumptions about justice and morality. And while new villains bring danger, familiar faces still hold the keys to unfinished business. So I'd say not to sideline Miami Metro again. The Miami Metro Police Department represents the richest untapped potential for the Dexter revival. New Blood completely abandoned the setting and its characters, focusing instead on the insular community in Iron Lake. While this served the story of Dexter's isolated new life, Resurrection needs to bring Miami Metro back into the fold to properly address the Bay Harbor Butcher revelations. Just think about the psychological impact on these characters when they discovered their friend and colleague was America's most prolific serial killer. Quinn, who once investigated Dexter before backing off, would be forced to confront his professional failure and personal betrayal. Masuka, who shared Dexter's forensic expertise and dark humor, would question every interaction they ever had. Matthews, who was close with Harry and protected Dexter throughout his career, would face the devastating realization that he enabled a killer for decades. These characters deserve to process the truth about Dexter Morgan. Miami Metro's investigation into the Bay Harbor Butcher case would provide perfect narrative tension. Perhaps Batista returns to Miami and reopens the investigation, recruiting his former colleagues to help uncover the full extent of Dexter's crimes. The psychological horror of this realization would be compelling television, one that would hit home for the OG fans too. These characters spent years working alongside a serial killer, sharing lunches, attending his wedding, and holding his son, only to discover it was all a part of an elaborate facade. Their professional identities as law enforcement officers would be shattered, forcing each to reconcile their past blindness with their duty to justice. Resurrection has the opportunity to transform Miami Metro from Dexter's unwitting cover into active pursuers of the truth. This evolution would honor the character's importance to the franchise while creating natural emotional stakes for the new storyline. The confrontation between Dexter and his former colleagues represents the payoff to tensions that have simmered since the very first episode. But if the past really matters, then the most important one to confront is the killing that set it all in motion. Harrison's kills and New Bloods need consequences. Harrison Morgan pulling the trigger on his own father cannot be treated as mere character development. This act, shooting Dexter in the chest and leaving him to bleed out in the snow, represents one of the most significant moments in the entire franchise. For Resurrection to maintain narrative integrity, this patricide must carry profound psychological and legal consequences.
Someone once said it's easier dealing with other people's problems than your own. They were wrong.
The psychological impact should be overwhelming. Harrison spent years searching for his father, briefly connected with him, then killed him when he discovered the full horror of Dexter's nature. This emotional whiplash would realistically leave Harrison traumatized, paranoid, and questioning his own capacity for violence. The series should portray Harrison experiencing flashbacks to the shooting, nightmares where Dexter haunts him, and intense guilt that shapes his every decision. Legally, Harrison committed a clear homicide. While Chief Angela Bishop let him flee Iron Lake with some cash, the legal system simply wouldn't ignore the shooting of a suspected serial killer. Harrison would realistically face a nationwide manhunt as a murder suspect. His flight to New York should include the constant threat of recognition, perhaps forcing him to change his appearance and identity, ironically mirroring Dexter's own pattern of reinvention. The consequences should extend beyond Harrison himself. Angela Bishop's career would be scrutinized for allowing a murder suspect to escape. Batista and Miami Metro would be investigating both Dexter's crimes and his apparent murder. Harrison's half-siblings, Aster and Cody, would be thrown into media spotlight as family members of both the Bay Harbor Butcher and his killer. Most importantly, Harrison's actions should force him to confront difficult questions about justice and violence. If he killed Dexter because his father's code was hypocritical, what does that make Harrison's own act of lethal judgment? This moral contradiction should be central to his development in Resurrection, not glossed over as a one-time character-defining moment. The shooting in New Blood was positioned as Harrison rejecting Dexter's path, but the irony is that by killing his father, he took his first steps down that very same path. This paradox should haunt Harrison throughout the new series, creating a complex foundation for his evolution as a character who understands the true weight of taking a life. And if Harrison's being haunted by what he did, then it's time the rest of the country started catching up, because the FBI needs to start connecting the dots. The absence of federal law enforcement in the Dexter saga represents one of the franchise's most glaring plot holes. Throughout 8 seasons of the original series, Dexter Morgan claimed over 100 victims across Miami without triggering sustained FBI involvement. Even after the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation in Season 2, federal authorities mysteriously abandoned the case once Dokes was framed, despite the unprecedented scale of his killings. This oversight became even more implausible in New Blood, where Dexter's murders in Iron Lake should have immediately connected to his past. The disappearance of Matt Caldwell, son of a prominent businessman, would realistically draw federal attention, especially given the interstate nature of Kurt Caldwell's trucking operation and crimes. For Resurrection to establish credibility, the FBI has to be more of a direct threat. The discovery of Dexter's identity as the Bay Harbor Butcher would trigger one of the largest serial killer investigations in American history. A specialized task force would be formed, combining agents familiar with the original case and new investigators examining Dexter's activities during his missing decade. The FBI's involvement would create natural tension as they piece together evidence from Miami, Iron Lake, and potentially other locations where Dexter operated. Their investigation could reveal previously unknown victims, forcing viewers to reconsider Dexter's legacy. Were there innocent people among his deserving targets? Did he leave survivors who could now identify him? Batista might serve as the bridge between Miami Metro and federal authorities, sharing his personal knowledge of Dexter while processing his own feelings of betrayal. This collaboration would give emotional weight to what might otherwise be a procedural investigation. The series should show the FBI applying modern forensic techniques to old evidence, running DNA from the Bay Harbor Butchers case through expanded databases, using advanced blood spatter analysis to reevaluate Dexter's work, and deploying behavioral analysis to understand his psychology. This would create a race against time as authorities get closer to locating both Dexter and Harrison. Most importantly, federal involvement would finally bring appropriate scale to Dexter's crimes. The Bay Harbor Butcher was effectively America's most prolific serial killer, responsible for more deaths than Bundy, Gacy, and Dahmer combined. This staggering body count deserves the full weight of federal investigation, creating the sense that Dexter's past has finally caught up with him in a way it never could during the original series. And once it starts closing in, you're going to need a bigger city to hide in. So, you need to set the show in a bigger area. Setting Resurrection in New York City marks a crucial evolution for the Dexter franchise. While Iron Lake's isolated community created the perfect backdrop for Dexter's attempt to hide from his past, the confined setting ultimately limited the storytelling possibilities. A small town with minimal law enforcement and few residents could only sustain the narrative tension for so long before feeling contrived. New York City provides the expansive canvas this story deserves. The Metropolis offers countless hiding places for both Dexter and Harrison, allowing them to disappear into anonymity while still remaining in constant danger of discovery. The city's complex law enforcement ecosystem, NYPD precincts, federal officers, and neighboring jurisdictions create natural obstacles and opportunities for characters on both sides of the law. Urban environments have always brought out the most compelling aspects of Dexter's character. Miami's vibrant culture contrasted brilliantly with Dexter's emotional detachment, while its sprawling geography gave him room to operate his killing ritual without immediate detection. New York offers similar advantages with fresh dynamics, dense population centers where privacy is paradoxically easier to maintain, diverse neighborhoods that provide distinct hunting grounds, and the constant flow of people that makes disappearances less immediately suspicious. From a narrative perspective, New York's setting enables multiple storylines to develop simultaneously without feeling disconnected. Harrison's new life at the Empire Hotel, Dexter's recovery and adaptation, Batista's investigation, and the FBI's pursuit can all unfold across different parts of the city while maintaining geographic credibility. The city itself can become a character in the storytelling, much as Miami did in the original series. New York's gritty underbelly provides perfect hunting grounds for killers, while its iconic landmarks could be reimagined as settings for pivotal moments. The constant surveillance of urban life, security cameras, witness potential, media presence would create new challenges for both Dexter and Harrison as they navigate their murderous impulses. More importantly, New York represents a symbolic fresh start while acknowledging the impossibility of truly escaping the past. Unlike Iron Lake, which felt like a temporary hiding place, New York has the scale and permanence to suggest this next chapter could be sustainable, making the inevitable collapse of any new normal all the more dramatic when the past finally catches up. But no matter how big the city gets, the real drama is still happening inside their heads. Bring back the voiceovers. The internal monologue defined Dexter Morgan as a character from the very first episode of the original series. Through his voiceovers, viewers gained intimate access to the mind of a serial killer, experiencing his detached observations, dark humor, and gradual emotional evolution.
My name is Dexter Morgan. I don't know what made me the way I am, but whatever it was left a hollow place inside.
Without this narrative device, Resurrection would lose the psychological depth that made the franchise so innovative. Harrison needs his own voiceover to properly explore his complex psychology. Unlike Dexter, whose inner voice was clinically analytical and emotionally distant, Harrison's narration should reflect his different backgrounds and temperament. Where Dexter compartmentalized his emotions, Harrison's voiceover might reveal raw internal conflict, a mind at war with itself as he processed the trauma of killing his father while grappling with his own violent impulses. The most compelling approach would incorporate both voices in Harrison's head. Imagine Harrison narrating his daily life in New York City, only to have Dexter's voice interrupting at crucial moments, challenging his son's choices, offering unwanted advice about potential kills, or reminding him of the code he claims to reject. This dual narration would create a psychological battle that visualizes Harrison's internal struggle in a way external conflict never could. This narrative technique would also allow Resurrection to maintain continuity with the original series while evolving in new directions. Dexter's familiar voice would satisfy longtime fans, while Harrison's contrasting perspective would prevent the show from becoming a simple retread. Their psychological interplay could create moments of both dark humor and genuine horror as Harrison tries to forge his own identity while carrying his father's legacy. The voiceover device could also resolve the practical challenge of maintaining Michael C. Hall's presence in the series without requiring him to appear in every scene. Even if Dexter survived a shooting, his physical condition might limit his screen time, but his voice could remain a constant presence in Harrison's mind, a persistent ghost that Harrison can't get away from no matter how far he runs. For Resurrection to fully explore the psychological inheritance Harrison has received from his father, it needs to give viewers the same intimate access to his thoughts that made Dexter such a compelling protagonist. Harrison's voiceover would be the essential tool for transforming him from a supporting character into a complex protagonist worthy of carrying the franchise forward. If Harrison's going to talk us through his descent, we need someone who's just as twisted to challenge every word. So bring in a counter-killer, someone who exposes flaws in the code. The Dexter franchise has repeatedly introduced antagonists who challenge Dexter's methodology, but never truly confronted the fundamental flaws in Harry's code itself. For Resurrection to break new ground, it needs an antagonist who directly exposes the hypocrisy inherent in the Morgan's family approach to justified killing. This counter-killer should operate from a moral framework that is simultaneously recognizable and disturbing. Perhaps they target people who cause indirect harm, corporate executives whose decisions led to deaths, negligent officials who failed to protect the vulnerable, or even vigilantes like Dexter whose actions cause collateral damage. By pursuing those whose hands remain technically clean, this antagonist would force Harrison to question whether his father's focus on direct killers was arbitrary and self-serving. The most compelling version of this character would have legitimate grievances against Dexter or his methodology. Maybe they're connected to an innocent person who was wrongly killed by Dexter. Or perhaps they're a relative of one of his victims who discovered the truth behind the loved one's disappearance. This personal connection would elevate them beyond a simple foil, creating emotional stakes that resonate with both characters and viewers. Unlike previous antagonists, this counter-killer shouldn't be obviously worse than Dexter. Their methods might even be less brutal. Perhaps they expose rather than kill, forcing their targets to face public justice rather than private execution. This moral gray area would challenge Harrison's inherited belief system far more effectively than another straightforward psychopath. The philosophical confrontation between Harrison and this antagonist should form the thematic core of Resurrection. Through their interactions, the series could finally address questions the original show often sidestepped. Who truly deserves to die? Can vigilante justice ever be morally justified? Does the code simply provide psychological comfort for killers who would murder regardless? These questions would elevate the revival beyond simple cat-and-mouse games into genuine ethical exploration. With Dexter's apparent survival, the dynamic becomes even more complex. Harrison, Dexter, and this new antagonist could form a twisted triangle, each representing different approaches to justice outside the law. Their interactions would force viewers to reconsider their own moral alignment with Dexter's methods, potentially disrupting the comfortable identification with a killer protagonist that defined the original series. And while the killer pokes holes in the code, someone else could remind us who really paid the price. We have to let the past catch up through the real victim fallout. The Dexter franchise has consistently shied away from deeply exploring the true victims of Dexter's vigilante justice. Not the killers he eliminated, but the families and loved ones they left behind. These secondary victims represent an untapped narrative goldmine that could provide Resurrection with emotional resonance beyond the father-son dynamic. Throughout 8 seasons, we rarely witness the ripple effects of Dexter's actions on innocent people connected to his targets. When Trinity killed Rita, the series showed how devastating a serial killer's actions could be on a family. Yet, ironically, the show never applied the same lens to examine how Dexter's kills affected similar families, people who lost fathers, brothers, or partners without explanation or closure. Resurrection has the perfect opportunity to introduce characters whose lives were permanently altered by Dexter's vigilantism. Perhaps a child of one of his victims grew up without a father, never knowing what happened. Maybe a partner spent years searching for answers about a disappeared loved one, only to discover that they were killed by the Bay Harbor Butcher. These stories would force both Dexter and viewers to confront the uncomfortable truth that even deserving victims were human beings with connections to innocent people. The most compelling approach would involve characters who blurred the lines between victim and threat. Someone who lost a family member to Dexter might pursue him for revenge, and for justice they genuinely deserve. Unlike previous antagonists motivated by psychopathy or criminal self-protection, these characters would have moral legitimacy that challenge our identification with Dexter. This exploration would add necessary complexity to the series' moral universe. Dexter's Code always focused narrowly on whether an individual deserved to die, never accounting for the broader consequences of their disappearance. By finally addressing these repercussions, Resurrection could evolve beyond the simplistic bad people deserve to die framework that sometimes limited the original series. Most importantly, this dimension would elevate stakes beyond Dexter and Harrison's personal journeys. Their actions would no longer exist in a vacuum, but would be shown to create real trauma for innocent people, a trauma that inevitably returns to confront them. This accountability would force both father and son to truly reckon with their impact on the world in a way that neither has fully faced before. Because after all that pain, after that fallout, there's only one thing left. Don't blow the ending again. The ending of Dexter has become a cautionary tale in television history. The original finale, with Dexter improbably surviving a hurricane to become a lumberjack in Oregon, is routinely cited as one of the worst conclusions in prestige television. New Blood's ending, while more decisive with Dexter's apparent death at Harrison's hand, still left audiences divided. Resurrection represents the final opportunity to provide the definitive conclusion this groundbreaking series deserves. For the ending to succeed, it must deliver genuine closure, while honoring the moral complexity that defined the show at its best. A satisfying conclusion can't simply repeat the pattern of previous finales, either letting Dexter escape consequences or killing him without fully exploring the implications. The resolution needs to address the central questions the series has posed since the beginning. Can someone like Dexter or Harrison ever truly change? Does vigilante justice ultimately create more harm than good? What is the true cost of living by the code? The strongest ending would force both Dexter and Harrison to face complete legal accountability and a more genuine moral reckoning with the damage they've caused. This doesn't necessarily mean death or imprisonment for either character, but it does require them to confront the truth, without the self-justifying narratives that are protecting their psyches. Resurrection should avoid the temptation to set up yet another sequel or spin-off. The franchise has already stretched its premise across multiple series, and continuing indefinitely would only diminish its impact. Instead, the conclusion should feel like the natural culmination of the Morgan family story, the inevitable destination towards which every previous season was building. More importantly, the ending must maintain internal consistency with the character's established psychology. Dexter's original finale failed because it betrayed his fundamental nature. The Dexter we knew would never abandon Harrison to become a lumberjack. Similarly, Resurrection's conclusion must emerge organically from the character's development throughout the series, rather than serving a predetermined narrative goal. The creative team has been given a rare third chance to end the story properly. With original showrunner Clyde Phillips returning and the benefit of learning from previous missteps, Resurrection has all the ingredients needed to deliver the definitive finale that fans have waited nearly 2 decades to see. The pressure is immense, but so is the opportunity to transform Dexter from a series remembered for its disappointing conclusion into one celebrated for its complete narrative arc. If you enjoyed the breakdown, subscribe with notifications on, and I'll see you in the next video about why the Brain Surgeon is Dexter's most terrifying villain.